Hello, this is Sam Gerrans from samgerrans.com. Today is Monday, April the 24th, 2023, and today is a long-form presentation, and the subject is Introduction to Propaganda. I might change the title. It's not very clickbaity. I don't know. I'll see how I feel when I sort of work with this and finish this off. But anyway, yeah, a long form presentation. What that means is that some part of it, small part of this is going to be on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, and all those sorts of things, and the rest of it is for my paid Substack subscribers. This is the only way I can keep going. It's how I do things. So nearly everything I do, in fact, all of everything that I did in my first projects was made available for free. But I need a model whereby I can either, offset some of the expenses or help us to get through doing this. So this is the way I do it. If you want to join my Substack, then the details will be at samgerrans.com. You just go to the front page, or I expect there'll be a drop down or something on here or in the description. Anyway, let's just get on with it. And what we're going to look at is this book. I'm just going to look at the introduction to this. This is Propaganda by Jacques Ellul, as we would say in English, or Ellul, as they would say in French. I'm going to stick with the English pronunciation because I'm talking to an English-speaking audience. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the introduction to this, which is by a chap called Konrad Kellen, and this book was written in 1964. And I'm not saying there aren't other books on propaganda that you should read if you want to understand how it works, but this, if you're going to read one, read this one. I'm not affiliated with the estate of Jacques Ellul or anything like that, but I did work in propaganda for a few years. I just happened to live in Russia. I happen to speak fluent Russian. I happen to be able to chew my food with my mouth closed, and I was offered a job in it's called Strategic Communications Company, and I worked in it for about 2 or 3 years. At a very high level. I just fluked my way into it, to be perfectly honest with you. But what I did when I was there was I worked out what it was we did, and I found it very interesting. And then I looked around. I mean, I always knew that what was in the press was nonsense, even prior to this. I mean, at university, people said, "Oh, you should be a journalist." I have very low opinion of journalism and journalists. I understood even then that it was just propaganda. And that it's impossible, almost impossible, to say anything meaningful in the Western media, or in fact any media probably, even then, and we're going back now to the 1990s. It's a whole load worse now. But anyway, what I'm going to do is look at this. I've got some notes, actually. And I'm going to kind of stop off and make some sort of comments as I go. But just to understand the backstory, for Ellul, propaganda is an absolutely necessary part of technique. Technique is how our modern societies are run. Now, he summarizes this in a way that is acceptable to people who just want everything in a sort of meme format. He says there are 4 basic postulates which every modern society has to accept. And I've been through this in more detail. I'm going to quickly run through them again. They are... And everyone believes this. And this is why I say there's no real distinction between, for example, the collective West on the one hand and Russia, where I live, on the other, because both sides of the equation believe exactly the same things. I mean, there might be some very minor tertiary differences, but essentially they believe the same 3 things. And the first one is man's aim is happiness. Now, if you read Dostoevsky, he may not agree with this, but certainly in modern Russian, if you stop one in the street, most of them, I mean, you still find some exceptional people here, but generally speaking, all they want is a better iPhone, okay? And whatever you mean by happiness, well, that's a question that you can leave for another day. The second postulate of modernity is that man is naturally good. Now, of course, under the Christian tradition, people never believed this before. If you read Psalms, or I think the Apostle Paul talks about it, behold, I was born in sin, shapen in iniquity, etc. So this is how mankind, certainly in the medieval period, regarded himself. In the traditional period, regarded himself. But now today, everyone's good. In fact, most people have become fairly psychopathic, if you ask me. The third is that history develops in endless progress. This idea that we're all progressing towards some sort of shining future, which is inevitable. I mean, let's face it, an iPhone 10 is better than an iPhone 1. Who could argue with progress? But this is an illusion. This is an illusion. It's also a lie. And for every supposedly progressive step that technique or technology in this case, which is one manifestation of technique, allows us, it creates a whole new load of problems. If you've noticed, if you have any children, you can't talk to them anymore. They can't remember what your name is because they're too busy staring at their phone. So there you are. And the last one is that everything is matter. Well, this is, I suppose, a manifestation of, I mean, it's not the first time that people have believed this. If you look at people like Democritus, I mean, he had a sort of evolutionary idea. But anyway, I mean, if you go back, you know, the idea of evolution and going back that everything essentially is matter, the Big Bang Theory, everything came from nothing, which is what Lawrence Krauss is pushing around with a straight face. I think he has some other problems at the moment. But anyway, people believe this. And this is where you end up, to put it into simplistic terms, with YOLO. Okay, that's it. That's what you end up. That's how you get there. Okay, YOLO, you only live once, which is used by, you know, the idiocracy as a way of sort of explaining, justifying their own solipsism to themselves, is the result of a whole load of philosophical thinking and writing that goes back centuries, but it can be condensed into YOLO. Anyway, quickly, let's move on. So yeah, we'll get into this. We'll read this, and the whole point of what I've just said about modernity is that it's anti-traditional. So in essence, any society which embraces modernity has to give up everything that its forefathers thought was important. Now, it seems that part of the problem part of the reason why people don't really like Russia at the moment is because Russia has some sense of its own tradition. I think a lot of people who tend to feel that the enemy of their enemy is their friend, and therefore kind of wholeheartedly side with Russia, are a bit naive as to how far this really goes, how deeply this really goes. But it is true that Russia does still have some vestigial allegiance to things like sanity. I mean, the idea that men and women are different, things like this, you know, just old ideas which technique, no matter from which quarter, eventually will destroy. But we're not going to get into that now. What we're talking about, propaganda. Propaganda is basically shaping your perception, making you think what someone else has planned. And I've seen it. I've seen it up up close and personal. Sitting down. I mean, I was working for particular clients, but you know, what is the messaging? What is the messaging? What do we want people to think? And all this. It was fascinating. These people, you know, men sitting in a room around a table deciding what you're going to think tomorrow. It was absolutely eye-opening. Anyway, we'll begin this. So this is the introduction. It's only 2 pages, and I'm going to read it and make some comments. But as I say, I'm going to stop off at some point and switch over just to my Substack paid subscribers for the rest of it, which will be most of it, actually. So to begin, this is page 5. Jacques Ellul's view of propaganda and his approach to the study of propaganda anew. 1964, this was written. The principal difference between his thought edifice and most other literature on propaganda is that Ellul regards propaganda as a sociological phenomenon. Before you go to sleep, it's going to get a bit more interesting in a minute, okay? Rather than as something made by certain people for certain purposes. All right, so what he's saying here is that for Ellul, well, I'd argue that it's both. That propaganda is actually organically arises from the mass as much as it is, well, I would argue, as much as it is kind of foisted upon them by, you know, men in smoky rooms deciding what you're going to think. I'd say it's both. In fact, I know it's both. Propaganda exists and thrives. It is the Siamese twin of our technological society. Excuse me. And then by technological society, that's what I just basically summarized. I mean, technique itself is not the same thing as technology, but technology is a manifestation of technique. And what we mean by technique is the kind of rationalistic, outcome-based, in the sense that it's only a rational outcome which is required society based on the 4 postulates that I just summarized, okay? And that's everywhere. That's everywhere, except perhaps some small places in the outback of the Amazon rainforest. It's everywhere now. It doesn't mean everywhere is on the same part of the conveyor belt, but everywhere is on the same conveyor belt, that's for sure. And I've lived in various places. I mean, the UK is on one part of the conveyor belt. Spain, which I've lived, is in another part. Georgia, lived in Georgia for a year. That was way back on the conveyor belt, but also always going the same direction and the same interest, promoting the same kind of depravity in Georgia as well. Using the youth, mainly. Ignorance is always a very useful tool to men like this. Russia and so on. So I've seen what I see in the places that I've lived, and also I've traveled a lot, is everywhere is on the same conveyor belt, and but just on different parts of it. As I've mentioned before, I went to Mongolia as part of my job once. I've been there 7 times, or 7 or 8, I can't remember. You think, I mean, out to Mongolia, but all they want is an iPhone and a can of Coke and some jeans. So everywhere is the same. It's all become generica. We all live in generica. Only in the technological society can there be anything of the type and order of magnitude of modern propaganda, which is with us forever, and only with the all-pervading effects that flow from propaganda can the technological society hold itself together and further expand. That's what he means by Siamese twin. These are twin pillars. These are the Boaz and Joachim of the entire edifice. Okay, this is how it works. You've got propaganda and technique. One without, well, I mean, propaganda is a manifestation of technique, but it also makes technique, it propagates technique. They work together. I had a comment here somewhere. Where's it gone? Yeah, I've covered that one. Okay, next. Most people are easy prey for propaganda, Ellul says, because of their firm but entirely erroneous conviction that it is composed only of lies and, quote, tall stories, and that, conversely, what is true cannot be propaganda. But modern propaganda has long disdained the ridiculous lies of past and outmoded forms of propaganda. It operates instead with many different kinds of truths, half-truth, limited truth, truth out of context. Even Goebbels always insisted that Weimar communiques be as accurate as possible. Now, I did a channel for a while during the Mariupol conflict. I was motivated to do that because I thought I'd try and educate people a little bit on how this works. And he's completely correct here. This is how it really works. Now, I'll give you an example. Now, consider, quote unquote, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Okay, which is, if you live in the West, this is all you've heard. Russia has attacked Ukraine for no reason, a sovereign state. How dare it do this terrible thing? And now we, the righteous West, who never start wars and never do anything terrible anywhere, and we only care about people so much, we're going to bankrupt ourselves in order to put things back to rights. You see. Now, I'm sure people watching this channel are awake to this type of nonsense, but it's a good example of exactly what we've talked about, what he said here, because it's absolutely spot on. Instead, it operates with many different kinds of truth, half-truth, limited truth, truth out of context. So it doesn't make up things out of whole cloth, or very rarely. What it does is completely misshape and bastardize the actual facts to a point where you couldn't possibly tell what's going on. A good example would be... I mean, I don't suppose my channel is even... I mean, I've already been shadow banned, I'm absolutely certain, and all the rest of it. So I'll just say it. Bucha. Okay? What happened in Bucha? Sure, people got killed. Sure, they're dead on the street. Yes, Russians were there at some point. Yes, the Ukrainians were there then. But any normal, grown-up analysis of the facts would demonstrate that the actual reality of what happened there was the inverse of what you were told. And these aren't, Kremlin talking points or whatever. I just got a functioning brain. If you don't believe me, look up Scott Ritter and listen to what he's got to say about it. Just listen to him. If you've never thought about it before, this is a man who does this sort of analysis for a living, okay? And just see what he's got to say about it. So, yes, there is a war in Ukraine. Yes, it is terrible. They show you the pictures. Terrible. War is terrible. But the way it works with propaganda is they'll show you the pictures, but it's the story. It's what they're telling you. It's the interpretation. That's where That's where propaganda operates, okay? It's a bit like women. You know, the facts are what they are, but by the time she's finished spinning up your mind, you don't know which way is up. In fact, I did notice that when I worked in this area, I wouldn't say it was predominantly women, but there was a high preponderance of women in it, and they were often extremely good at it, because there's the ability to kind of hold many contradictory ideas in the mind and not really have any particular allegiance to any of them, and all the rest of it, and intrigue. A lot of them were absolutely excellent at it. I have to say I wasn't. I had the basic skill set, but the other skills that to get really good at this, I didn't want to acquire them. I could see what they were, but I didn't want them. So that's partly why I left. Anyway, let's carry on. So yes, so there is a war in Ukraine. Yes, it is terrible, and we all agree with that. Russians agree with it. Ukrainians agree with it. Everyone in the West agrees with it. But it's the interpretation of what's going on there and why it's happening. But if you ask any of the people who are out there with anybody, I do challenge you. If you live in the West and you see somebody with a "We Stand with Ukraine" flag in the window, go and ask them. You don't have to be rude. You don't have to. Just say, look, I'm really. You clearly stand with Ukraine, and you must. I'd like to know more. Could you please explain to me what the backstory is to this? And if they're not able to go back any further than what was it, February of last year, you know, just for no reason, the Russians decided just to invade Ukraine, and this is terrible. If that's their starting point and they knew nothing prior to that, well, then it just proves my point, doesn't it? They've been totally propagandized. Because there is a backstory to this, and you know, if you decide to investigate that backstory and you are able to come up with a convincing counter argument, you know, fine, that's fine. But probably, if you stand firmly with Ukraine and think that what's going on is right and good, and this is what we should do, you probably know nothing about what happened before that. And there's a reason why you know nothing. Okay, the media could have told you, but they're not going to. It's not their job to inform you. It's their job to delude you. That's what they do. That's the job. That's their only job. All right. Now, if you would like a little bit of information on what the backstory is, I will link below to John Mersheimer, who is no friend to Russia, but he's an American academic. And it's what's more as interesting as what he says is when he says it, because it's 2015 when he made this presentation, way, way, way before most people could have found Ukraine on a map. In fact, they probably couldn't find Ukraine on the map. And he'll explain the backstory to you. And my argument isn't that you should accept that. My point, if you want to call it rather than an argument, is that why didn't you know that? You see, if the media were to in any sense to inform you of the facts, you'd know all this, and you would have a counter argument to it. You know, despite the fact, you know, that if you take the Minsk agreements, that Germany and France, which stood as guarantors to that, have openly admitted that it was a farce. They had no intention of keeping their word, you know, on the contracts that they'd signed with Russia, and that Russia had, you know, bent over backwards to find a diplomatic agreement to this, that 14,000 people were bombed and still being killed, incidentally, being shelled, civilians in Donetsk day after day, just Ukrainians standing there bombing, you know, civilians. These are facts. These are facts. Today, for example, you know, the regime in Kiev is out there burning Christian churches. Did you know about that? If you know who's really behind all this, you'll find that this is a bit of a pattern. They did exactly the same thing in Russia when they took over Russia, and it wasn't Russians, in 1917. Anyway, we'll carry on with this for now. So my point is that you probably, if you do stand firmly with Ukraine, and you know you're very sure that you're right, that you know nothing about it. And my point isn't to kind of call you names, but just to kind of point out that that's the fact, and that is the result of propaganda. So that's what that's about. To continue, a second basic misconception that makes people vulnerable to propaganda is the notion that it serves only to change opinions. That is one of its aims, but a limited, subordinate one. Much more importantly, it aims to intensify existing trends, to sharpen and focus them, and above all, to lead men to action, or when it is directed at immovable opponents, to non-action, through terror or discouragement to prevent them from interfering, i.e. to make them passive. Now, there are a couple of points on this. Yeah, it's much more, this is me now, about nudging rails than it is about stopping or starting trains. Yeah, the people at the top, they're clever men. They didn't get to where they are by being completely stupid. And although, as I'll get to later on in the second half of this, they are degenerate, they're not stupid. They know how things work. And so the existing propaganda, if you take, for example, about Russia, there was a whole load of backstory about how people felt about Russia. So what they didn't suddenly wake up and say, Russia's now evil and bad. There was a whole load of stuff that predated that. And we'll get into this in a minute down below when we talk about agitation propaganda and integration propaganda, because it's two different types of propaganda. And you tend to think of propaganda as just being, people are aware to some extent of agitation propaganda, which is what they've got now. Like, people can see that, let's just say, for example, the things which are just being said about Russians, if they were being said about Jews, you'd be horrified. You'd be horrified. Taking their possessions, not giving them jobs, kicking them out of countries, putting journalists in prison, which is happening in Latvia and Germany. And if this was happening to Jews, everybody would be absolutely horrified. But it's only happening to Russians, so who cares? The way that propaganda works also is that there are no actual objective standards. There are just feelings, triggers about things. Those triggers are placed. It's a very clever technique, and most of your opinions, in fact, probably I would say the vast majority of them are placed in there. It's like acupuncture. You'll think this. You'll think, I've had problems. I'm sure everybody, on this channel with their families. You try to talk to your family about certain subjects. You can't talk to them. It's not a rational process. You're not reasoning with somebody. It's not about facts. It's not about reason. It's got to help you if you're right as well. Being right's got nothing to do with it. You're trying to interface with something which doesn't have the contact points that you're presenting. It's like trying to dig out the sea using a pitchfork. You're never going to do it. You cannot undo $1 trillion worth of propaganda. You cannot. You just have to get used to it. On any subject. My youngest brother, with whom I have most in common, he says, talking about people that we know, he said if you could reason with them, with what he calls being a libtard, he said they wouldn't exist. And he's right. Reason's got nothing to do with them, nothing whatsoever. And that's the efficacy of propaganda. It's impervious to reason. So don't try to reason with it. You can't. It's a waste of time. Anyway, that was that part. Yes. Therefore, to continue, Ellul distinguishes various forms of propaganda and calls his book Propaganda. That plural is one of the keys to his concept, or propagandise in French. Well, you don't have the answer, but what he's trying to say is that in the original French, this book is not just called propaganda, but propagandas with an S. Okay, because there are two types of propaganda. In fact, there are three. And the two that he's mentioning here are agitation propaganda and integration propaganda. To continue, the former leads men to mere resentment, from mere resentment to rebellion. The latter aims at making them adjust themselves to desired patterns. The two types rely on entirely different means. Both exist all over the world. I'll just stop there. Before we get into agitprop, I'll just talk about integration propaganda. When I first, if you've ever gone to live in a really foreign country, I don't just mean moving from London to Paris. I mean going from, say London to Mozambique or something. Well, for me, I came to Russia, and I came to Russia in I think I first came out in 1990. And spent a lot of time here. This wasn't just a foreign country. I mean, if I'd come here now, it wouldn't have been so stark. But coming here then, which was essentially, like the country had been held in stasis since the end of the Second World War. And it was going back 50, 60 years into a country where they had a completely different set of propaganda from the kind of propaganda that I'd had. And looking at another country, especially when you speak the language, and seeing how propagandized, well, not how propagandized they are, that's not quite true, but just seeing, for example, the types of things, like if you're English, I'll just give you just an example. If you're English and you've watched Monty Python, you all know, certain things, and it becomes part of the kind of the popular culture. This is really what we're talking about, integration propaganda. Today, it's things like MTV or these ghastly rappers and the Kardashians. This is propaganda. It's propagandizing you into a certain set of kind of values. Well, coming to a completely different culture, which had just come out of what Russians called Dobry Sovietsky Vremena, which means like the good old Soviet days, which is what people look back on now. It's quite a lot of people, with a certain amount of, I don't know, they miss it to a certain extent. But you notice that in the kind of things that they talk about, just snippets of things that people know. I'll give you an example. There's a different Winnie the Pooh in Russian. Russian Winnie the Pooh's a whole genre in and of itself. It's a cartoon. It's absolutely brilliant, and it's done with incredible humour. And there's just there are lines from this. For example, "Можно без хлеба," which it's just a line from this part of this thing where Winnie the Pooh goes to visit Rabbit. And he's eating all of his food, but these are lines that are not in the original Winnie the Pooh, because to me, I'm British, Winnie the Pooh's British. And then you've got the American Winnie the Pooh, which is this kind of ghastly, saccharine nonsense, which, I suppose, only America could come up with. If you see the American Winnie the Pooh cartoon, it's just, to me, as an Englishman, it just means nothing whatsoever. Because I read A.A. Milne as a child, had it read to me, and this is just part of how I grew up. So I know the real Winnie the Pooh. But coming to Russia, I realised they have a Winnie the Pooh too, and their Winnie the Pooh is just as effective as our Winnie the Pooh. And he's a different Winnie the Pooh. He's a completely different character. They haven't kind of Disneyfied him. They've Russified him. Anyway, my point is that this is all propaganda too. Now, was A.A. Milne or the people who made, it saves me the film, who made the Russian Winnie the Pooh, or even the ghastly people who create this nonsense in America, are they actively propagandists? No, they're not. But what they are is repeaters. They're repeaters of if you know how routers work, like you've got Wi-Fi, you've got the main Wi-Fi, sort of zooming out the rays, and then you can have repeaters that pick up the same thing and kind of pass it on. That's what it is. So once you've been propagandized yourself, you're able to then kind of express it and repeat it and intensify it as you pass it along. All of that's to say is that all this stuff that you grow up with, whether it's TV, the Kardashians, I don't know, whatever it is, this is the background propaganda. And when it comes to Russia, okay, for example, I'm not here to defend Russia. I'm just using Russia because it's a place that it's current at the moment. We're on the brink of World War III, so maybe we'll all be dead tomorrow. So I think it's worth talking about. And I live here, and I can use it to compare. So when I see the way that Russia is presented in the West, yes, you've got this agitprop, which is this in your face, everything's terrible, big, bad, terrible Russians, okay? But you've also got this integration propaganda, which would be, for example, things like Hunter Biden's laptop is a Russian propaganda thing, or what's the other one? Trump is a Russian agent, so you've got or again, even more kind of like long-term propaganda. You have something like James Bond, what was he called? They all sound Russian. We meet again, Mr. Bond. All of this, Russians, they're evil. See, they've been evil for a very long time. Maybe they are evil. I'm not even arguing that they're not evil. I'm just saying that the people's opinions are shaped entirely by all of this stuff. Anyway, there is a plan to this talk, but I have temporarily lost it. No, I haven't. Okay, so the former agitation propaganda, which is what you're getting in the West right now about how evil Russians are, and if you want to know how vitriolic and doubtful all of this propaganda is, just replace the word Russian with Jew, and then read it and just see how you'd respond to that. You see, because you've got another load of propaganda. You've been what I call propaganda conflict, when you've got two different strains of propaganda fighting in your brain at the same time. The latter, integration propaganda, which is We meet again, Mr. Bond. That kind of propaganda aims at making them adjust themselves to desired patterns. This is how we get used basically to either virtue signal or, gush on command or whatever it is, donate to charities you know nothing about, all that stuff. The two types rely on entirely different means. Both exist all over the world. Integration propaganda is needed especially for the technological society to flourish. See, it's how they get you. It's why you believe the four things that I summarized before. That's why you believe these. You've been indoctrinated into them, honestly. Our forefathers never believed those four things, which were man's aim in life is happiness, man is naturally good, history develops in endless progress, and everything is matter. I've gone into this in much more detail elsewhere. In fact, our forefathers believed the inverse of all those things. But you don't believe them, probably. And do you know why you don't believe them? Well, I'll tell you why you don't believe them. You don't believe them because you've been indoctrinated by this integration propaganda. It's in everything. It's all right. To give you kind of a picture of it. Agitation. Let's say you got a goldfish in a goldfish bowl. All right. The agitation propaganda is the dog kind of huffing and puffing, walking around the goldfish bowl, scaring the goldfish. That's the agitation propaganda. The integration propaganda is the water. Okay, that's the difference. All right. I think that's what I'm going to stop there. And yeah, I'm going to stop there for my public platforms. The rest of this, because I'm just sort of winding myself up for this, is going to be on Substack for my Substack paid subscribers. Anyway, so details of where I upload to, how you can join my Substack and Telegram channel and support my work and download my books free are in the description below. Thanks for listening and bye for now.